Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the penultimate session of what has clearly been an absolutely fantastic conference. You may well recall that in my opening address, it seems a long time ago, but it was only yesterday morning, I mentioned that this big topic of the government review of university spinouts and processes related thereto, and that we would be joined today by one of the leaders of that review, Andrew Williamson. I'm delighted that he's come to talk to us, seek our views, understand who we are, where we're coming from, and how this review can be actually a very valuable tool to help us all in so very many ways. So I will quickly introduce Andrew. Andrew is a physicist, Cambridge physicist, who basically left the country many decades ago because he realised this kind of venture activity and exciting science was probably easier done in the States. He spent 20 years in the United States, 10 running a lab in the Lawrence Livermore labs in California, followed by then 10 years and he spun out 2 of his own businesses. So some real experience from the research side of that. He knows what that is from the hard end, obviously in a different environment. He then spent another 10 years, and apologies for praising this so quickly, Andrew, in the venture capital business, working in both San Francisco and Chicago. So again, working with this kind of business. He came back to the UK some 6-7 years ago to join Cambridge Innovation Capital. Cambridge Innovation Capital, which I'm sure he'll tell you a little bit more about, is a fund based in Cambridge, founded by ourselves, really to help with the next phase of funding beyond the seed activity. And he chairs a very important committee in the BVCA around this aspect of this part of the venture sector. And consequently, in a meeting we know the heat and light or the shouting and screaming that's been going on around the equity debate. That gave rise to a meeting with the Chancellor, Jeremy Hunt, and then that provoked this review. And I would say that review is led by 2 VCs. I joked about that before. Andrew from the money side, and Irene Tracy, one of life's extremely smart people, the Vice Chancellor of Oxford, from the sort of creator side, looking at this very critically important point because it's important to our great national endeavour. And that review we are in very good hands, but it has of course caused a little bit of concern, worry, controversy, possibly in some places, I think probably ill-founded. So Andrew's here to talk about that review and seek your views in this session. So please make the very most of it. I think it's extremely important because we want to think about where we are in 5 and 10 years' time and have played a huge part in changing that world for massively the better as we capitalise on being a science nation, innovation-driven nation. So I'd like to hand over to Andrew. I'm delighted you're here. Thank you so very much for coming, Andrew. The floor is completely yours.
Thank you, Ian. Good afternoon. So thank you very much for inviting me. It's an honour to be here, and the timing is absolutely perfect that you're having your big annual meeting right as we're getting to the meat of this review. So we've got a lot to talk about. Let me just bring up my notes here. So let me start by trying to allay some fears, and then I'll go back and talk a little bit about what this review is, the perspectives I bring to it, the perspectives Irene brings to it, what we've been doing so far, the data that we've gathered, the preliminary assessment of that data that we have, and maybe even some preliminary thinking about what we might be recommending that the government do. I'm going to give you a heads up right now. I want to leave lots of time for questions at the end, and everybody we speak to in this review, and as you'll learn in a second, we've spoken to nearly everybody. We asked them the one question, which was, if you were king for a day, and so you could change a policy, you could change a law, you could redirect some funding, not a lot of new funding because we're broke, but if you could redirect some funding, or anything else involved in going from idea to IPO, as they say, what would you do? Right, we want the bolder ideas, the better, right? So, think you've got about 30 minutes to come up with your ideas, and then we'll start to go around the room. So, first of all, maybe just to allay some fears. So, as Ian said, the genesis of this review, if I'm honest, is, there's been a growing amount of, I think it was heat, the word that Ian used, or noise is the word I would use, particularly in the Twitterverse, around this topic of equity splits at the stage of spin out from a university. Rather unfortunate discussion, in my opinion, misinformed, in many cases mischaracterizing or blatantly just misinterpreting data that's out there. But the data that's out there is largely anecdotal as well, which is unhelpful. So there has been a growing amount of heat and noise around this whole topic. And that happens at the same time that there's a growing level of importance assigned to everything that we all do. We just had lunch with some of the leaders from some of the TTOs, and I said, at no point in my career have I ever found myself in a situation where there's such universal cross-party support for what we do, right? The recognition that in a post-Brexit world, if a medium-sized economy that's been gifted some world-class universities wants to find its way in the world, this science superpower agenda and the innovation and commercialization and wealth creation and productivity increases and increases in standard of living that will come from that, that is universally accepted from the Prime Minister down to the Chancellor, down to the business departments in the current government, and almost identically accepted in the Labour Party as well. And if you look at the commentary in the recent Jim O'Neill spin-out review that was launched at the end of last year, they're using very similar language. So there is massive goodwill and support from policymakers, and I think that flows down into the general public and the general business community to see us be successful in spinning out great businesses from the great universities in this country. That's a wonderful position to be in, and I frankly have never been in that position. One of the reasons, as Ian said, that I went to the States was when I was graduating in the 90s. It was just all a bit apathetic here, and there wasn't much going on. I was in Cambridge. There were no spin-outs at that point. There was no venture capital. Silicon Valley was very different. I came back 20 years later, and Cambridge looks a lot more like Silicon Valley than it did when I left. So we're in a really good place, and there's really goodwill to try and make this as successful as possible. But when you see all of this noise in the Twitterverse and this whinging and complaining and essentially acrimony between founders and TTOs or investors and TTOs, it just sucks all of the energy and enthusiasm and support out of the room. So what we're trying to do with this review, in a nutshell, is change the narrative, put ourselves back on a positive footing of excitement and ambition, celebrating really the great successes that already exist and are being achieved around the country in spinning out wonderful businesses, but building upon those and doing more and more. So we held our first advisory board meeting. We've got a number of stakeholders that I'll talk about in a second, but we have an advisory board that represents each of the different stakeholder groups that's involved in this spin-out process. And we brought them in to DSIT and had a meeting a couple of weeks ago. And some of the TTO representatives understandably said, well, look, we've seen all the noise in the press, and then we see a review's announced. There's a venture capitalist who's one of the co-chairs of it. I assume I'm just here so you can bash me over the head about equity splits. And it could not be more different than that, right? So we're from the government. We're here to help, right? We're not here to bash you over the head, right? I mean, this is about trying to, as I said, change the narrative, share best practices, and move things forward. So I hope that we can have a discussion that's collaborative and in the spirit of, 1 + 1 = 5 here. So that's the spirit in which I'm here to address that. And one of the reasons I came in person to address you and to essentially tell you all of that. Okay, so what have we been doing so far? Well, it's quite a complex world. I mean, this spin-out business, it's, as I was saying over lunch, it's a nascent industry, certainly in the UK, right? I mean, the concept of spinning businesses out of universities has really only been around 10 or 20 years. Doing it in the knowledge-intensive sectors, which is really what we're mostly focused on here, IP-based businesses, so the life sciences, the physical sciences, computer science, that's really only been going for a decade or so in this country. So it's still a bit of an artisanal business, and it's an early-stage business, certainly compared to the States. So what we're trying to do is engage with everybody that's involved in that journey and get their perspective. So Irene Tracy, the Vice-Chancellor of Oxford, is talking with her peers, the Vice-Chancellors of all of the research-intensive universities around the country, either one-on-one or through roundtables, to hear the university perspective. And one of the things that struck me when I first met with Irene and started planning out this review was the perspective that she brings and that university leadership brings, is that it's all very well to celebrate the economic and wealth and value creation that's coming from some of these spin-outs, but we're doing that in a university environment which is fundamentally fiscally challenged. And even the biggest, most successful universities like Oxford and Cambridge are barely getting by, right? And are subsidizing fundamental research and teaching through various different pots of money. So we are in a fiscally very constrained position. That's fundamentally different to, say, the largest universities in the US. And so Irene has brought that perspective, and as we think through recommendations, just pulling a few million extra out of the general fund of a university to fund more seed businesses or more translational funding is clearly not going to happen, because that money's not there and they're already constrained. So Irene brings that perspective. And our goal is to talk to all of the leadership of the universities involved in this sector. Similarly, with the TTOs, we estimate there's somewhere between 40 and 50 tech transfer offices that have at least one full-time person that's involved in licensing and or spin-outs. We want to talk to all of you. So Robin and Diego, do you want to just stand up and wave so that then people can come and grab you afterwards? Right, so this is Robin and Diego. So Irene and I, do a few Zoom calls with these guys. These guys and their teams within the Treasury and DSIT are doing all of the work. They have already reached out to many of you to talk about the TTO process and learn more about it. They have prepared a survey that will be distributed probably through PraxisAuril or directly, to the extent we have your contact details, to all of the TTOs next week, right? Yeah. Just so we can get a little bit more granular data on particularly the operating finances of TTOs. So we want to talk to all of you, and we want to understand your business. We want to walk in your shoes, and so that will happen. Founders, obviously a key part of this, and so there are academic founders, there are non-academic founders, there are early stage management teams. We think there's about 1,800 active spin-outs here in the country right now, and we're trying to talk to all of them. So we've developed quite a comprehensive survey. Thomas Ulrichsen, who's here, some of the areas at the back, helped us put together some of these questions. So, if the stats aren't quite right, or if there's any unintended bias, it's his fault. It's with a lot of effort went into making that as thoughtful and as comprehensive as possible while being completable in 10 minutes. That's always the balance, right? So we have pushed that out through every channel that we can think of. So I chair the BVCA, so we've gone to all of the venture capital firms that invest in spin-outs. We've pushed it out through the TTOs, angel groups. If anyone in this room is not aware of that founder spin-out, we should make you aware, and we'd like you to distribute it as broadly as possible. We want to get the opinions of everybody who's ever worked in this sector. So that's the founder piece. Then there's the investor piece. I'm sad to say that I exist in a pretty lonely little group. There's probably, depending on how you count it, 20 or 30 venture capital firms in the UK that routinely invest in university spin-outs. So over the last couple of weeks, I've met with all of them and heard their war stories and their moans, but also their massive enthusiasm to do more of this, and to get more involved, and to do more spin-outs, and to raise more capital, and celebrate the successes that then lead to more capital and expand this industry. There's also lots of government departments, so we're spending quite a lot of time with people like Innovate UK, the British Business Bank, Research England, because there are a lot of programs already active in the space. We're not trying to recreate the wheel or duplicate things. If anything, some simplification, some consolidation, and some enhancement, I think, is probably more what's required here. So we've been talking to all of those stakeholder groups, and that's been going on for the last couple of months. And I would say we're now coming towards the end of that information gathering phase. And it's been fascinating, and we've got some really interesting information. So I'd just give you a few highlights and lowlights of what we've learned so far. let me just bucket these into a few categories. So the first one, I would say, it may sound a bit simplistic or trivial, but I think it's fundamentally important. And that is just perception of the industry and the sector. And the fact that, and I can say this because I'm still a British citizen, even though I lived in the US for 20 years, we're still too bloody British about all of this. And we're so good at whinging about the stories that didn't quite work and the startups that didn't quite spin out, or the technology that failed, or the terms that weren't quite right, or the VCs that wouldn't put in enough money. And all this, there's a million reasons why startups fail, and because it's a hard business, and most startups do fail. We're terrible at celebrating the successes, and as I said at the beginning, there are a lot of successes. The rate at which capital is being deployed into this sector, at which business is being created, IPOs are happening, huge amounts of wealth is being created, amazing technology is being commercialized for societal good. All of that's happening, but it's getting drowned out by the noise. So the biggest request we got from everyone involved in the ecosystem, can we turn the narrative? Can we find ways to better communicate what's going on here? And I would, in the questions at the end, I'd love anybody's suggestions on how we can help advocate for what you do. We have some ideas, but we can come back to that. Second area that we got a lot of feedback on is the skills and talent gap. And I think this, as I said a few minutes ago, this is a nascent industry. So there's just not many people who've done it before. When I was working in Silicon Valley, venture capital there is quite easy, to be honest. You have a stable of founders that you've backed to start businesses that have been successful, and when they exit one business, you recycle them and you have them do the next business that's not that different from the one they last did. So they have a playbook on how to build it. They get the gang back together in terms of the management team that built the last business, and they can build the next one, and it's just a slightly different technology or a slightly different variant or a slightly different market. That's happening in some sectors here. I would say therapeutics, for example, is a case where the playbook is relatively mature of how you go from early stage biology to your assays, to early stage hits, to leads, and then through the clinical development process. But in AI or semiconductors or quantum computing or most medical devices, there's no playbook. And there's very few people in this country who've ever run that playbook, either as a founder or a manager of a startup or as an investor like me working with those founders, because we just haven't been doing it long enough, right? The joke in the venture capital industry is it takes 5 years and $50 million to train a VC, and that's about right, actually, if you factor in all the failures along the way. So one of the things that we're thinking about in this review is the skills and the experience set will naturally grow organically as more businesses work through the cycle and successfully exit, and people return and do more business, do their next business. And I'm delighted to say the last couple of spinouts we've done in Cambridge actually have been those entrepreneurs' fifth or sixth business. But that's still a rarity, right? So what can we do to accelerate the acquisition of skills and knowledge throughout the ecosystem? So upskilling the early stage founders, whether it's the graduate students, the postdocs, the early stage sort of entrepreneurially curious academics who want to spin out businesses, upskilling the management teams that will be brought in those early stages. There's still too many people hanging around this industry that are past their sell by date or have irrelevant experience and are sort of latching onto companies. We need to be much better at sort of filtering through and really getting the dynamic drivers of those businesses. Upskilling the investors, because frankly, building a quantum computing or an immuno-oncology company is a lot harder than building the next food delivery app. And we're not talking about food delivery apps here. We're talking about real businesses built on fundamental IP and how you go through all of that journey. I went through the Kaufman Fellows program. There's something here in the UK called the Newton Fellows program, which is starting to build on that. What more can we do in that space? So again, any suggestions on upskilling and talent across the ecosystem, most appreciated. One idea that I rather like, that I think also goes back to the whole topic of sort of some of the acrimony that's built up because of all of the heat in the press is this sort of cross-fertilization between the different stages in the journey. So we have the great fortune of working very closely with Cambridge Enterprise in Cambridge, almost on a daily basis, and for many years our office was on the floor below them. So the sort of cross-fertilization of experiences of, them sharing with us over coffee, the therapy sessions that they've just been through with some of the academics who walk in the door with sometimes unrealistic expectations about their IP and their demands for patenting and their demands for setting up a business and getting it funded. We share with them some of our scar tissue, our businesses that launched in the wrong direction and wasted too much money doing the wrong thing. If we planned it better, we'd done it the other way. So that cross-fertilization worked great. We're starting to welcome more PhD students and postdocs as interns into our venture capital firm, into our portfolio companies, into the businesses that are being backed by Cambridge Enterprise. That kind of cross-fertilization, I think, upskills, but maybe more importantly, builds advocates, and it just builds empathy and understanding that this is hard for everybody. That of course there are negotiations and there are tensions, and people have slightly different positions on a lot of these discussions, but we're all pulling in the same place, which is to try and spin out great, impactful businesses. And so I think there's a lot that can be done on sort of skills and talent and sharing of ideas. How am I doing? Okay, let's get to the meat of it. Terms, processes, the whole sort of spin out process. Actually, the biggest feedback we heard from founders and investors was not equity splits. And in fact, the vast majority of investors would say, to be honest, I'm not sure if I'm aware of a single spin out that failed to launch because equity splits couldn't be agreed. Nobody ever gets quite what they want, and maybe some deals are a bit out of market, and there's some things that can be done there, but that's not the biggest issue. The biggest issue was speed. And again, the speed, right? And some people will walk in and say to us, oh, it took 5 years to spin out my business. I'm like, really? And and when did the clock start on that 5 years? Well, when I was having a shower and I was thinking about, starting a business. I'm like, well, that's not right? And so but when does the clock actually start in terms of you walked into your TTO and said, I've got this patent and I've got funding lined up for my startup and I'd like a license. So we're trying to cut through all of that and understand exactly how long things take and where the frictions are. And so to the extent that you can share that advice, particularly, or those experiences with Robin and Diego, that would be brilliant. And to the extent that there are sort of generalized friction points that we can help address, we would very much like to do that. There is a really nice example that's cropped up in the last year or so, which is the UCIT guidelines. I assume everyone in this room is intimately familiar with that. I think that's a brilliant example of this nascent industry coming together, self-regulating, self-supporting, sharing of best practices, the kind of things that you would expect a professional industry as it's growing to do for itself. I was at the launch event a couple of months ago and the sort of post-launch celebration earlier this week, and it's been fabulously well received. And it cuts through so much of this noise that we've talked about and sets out some simplified explanations of the key terms and structures, which can be quite intimidating, particularly if it's the first time you've done some of this stuff. So I think that's an example of a best practice that can be shared. We think there's probably room to do more on top of that. Some of you may be familiar that the equivalent of UCIT, I think it's called BOLT in the US, has gone as far as actual term sheets and template license agreements with, albeit bracketed terms and options and menus and things, but starting to set some guidelines to, I think, speed up the process. Even the lawyers admitted to us, if you limit the number of things that we can negotiate for on behalf of our client, whichever side they're on, we'll get less fees, but this thing will go faster, and in the end, that's good for everybody because we really want to push these businesses forward. So I think there's quite a lot that can be done there, and again, would welcome anyone's feedback or suggestions in the questions on that. Next general topic actually, and this is my last journal topic, so we can have plenty of time for questions, is around the concept of sort of critical mass and scale. So when I worked in Silicon Valley, I mean, the brilliant thing about that region is the concentration of activity. And you know, when you're early in your career to go to a bar or a dinner party or whatever, and everybody you meet is a founder or an investor or a service provider or is involved in this ecosystem. And there's just an energy that's infectious about that. And people go to Silicon Valley to get a job in tech or biotech or whatever. Just as you go to Hollywood to become an actor or something, and you assume once you get there you'll land your movie roles. You can go to the Bay Area and land a CTO role, a CBO role, whatever it is that aligns with your background. And people feel comfortable do that because of the critical mass of activity that's happening there. And when one business goes bust, and of course lots of them do, you recycle the talent into the next business, and the investors are pulling their founders and they're going in. And it's all feeding off itself. Everything from the founding universities, which is mostly Berkeley and Stanford, through to the small businesses, all the way up to the large tech and biotech companies, which are providing sort of the best practices and the training required for how to operate a business at scale. It's a brilliant thing. I hadn't seen it anywhere outside of Silicon Valley in my career until actually Cambridge in the last few years. So we have our offices in Station Road in Cambridge now, and I have Microsoft and Amazon and Samsung and Apple and ARM and AstraZeneca all on the same street. And there's thousands of startups in the different science parks and biomedical campuses around us, and the university's feeding more in. We're starting to see a new phenomenon that we call spin-ins. So this is IP from all over Europe, typically, that's coming to the region because that criticality of talent and IP and capital and service providers and some infrastructure, not enough, exists. So how do we recreate that? How do we see that? How do we have 6, 10, 15 of those around the UK? Well, there's some great work going on, right? So, a good friend of mine, Duncan Johnson, is now running Northern Gritstone. So that's Manchester, Leeds, and Sheffield, recognizing that there wasn't quite the critical mass or the deal flow or the volume of activity to have a big incubator, accelerator, and then venture capital activity. And so by coming together, they've raised a very significant amount of capital and are generating the similar level of enthusiasm and dynamism around Manchester, Leeds, and Sheffield. We were talking over lunch about Set Squared and the work that they've been doing down in the southwest and really building a critical scale for supporting founders and now moving that up potentially to venture funding as well. So I think there's a pathway there, and when you've got multiple regions like this operating at scale, developing their own best practices, playbooks for how to do what we're all trying to do here, well, then we can hook them up and they can start sharing best practices and ideas. And some regions will be more focused on AI, and others on life sciences, and others on clean tech and climate tech. And some of those practices can be shared, but some of them will end up with specializations. So I think there's a vision there for how this can really get turbocharged and accelerated, but we need to get to some scale so that all of this works well. I'm going to... I think that's about it. Did I miss anything? I'm looking at that. No, they're saying, okay, good. All right, so that was about half an hour. Let's take a few questions, either on the review and where we are in it and where we want to go, or king for the day ideas, or any of the above.
Hi. One of the questions I've got is the Twitterverse, because I'm sure that you've spoken to the relevant Twitter people who do who do it, and I worry because some of the stuff they're putting out on LinkedIn is I've been wanting this, a new playbook, and if it doesn't go the way they want, where basically universities take zero equity, is essentially probably where they're heading, is we're going to have the same noise and heat all over again. And so will this solve that? How do we overcome that, or do we just ignore it and hope it goes away?
Yeah, it's a really good question. Well, 0% is clearly not going to happen. That would drive all kinds of weird behavior, right? So, how do I answer that? I think one of the reasons you heard me spend about 5 minutes at the beginning talking about everybody that we've spoken to is I want there to be no mistaking the fact that this was comprehensive, systematic, all opinions have been heard. So there can be no accusation of, well, you didn't ask for my opinion. If you'd only asked me, I would have told you that it should have been 0% or whatever. Right? So we want to include all opinions. Obviously, we can't make everybody happy all of the time, but we're trying to come up with recommendations that I think are broadly consensus-driven, make common sense, and actually the draft list of things that we're looking at, I think is relative. I had a trial balloon with some of them over lunch, and there was a lot more nodding than tutting, let's put it that way. So I think we can get there. I'm quite excited about what we have on the list. I would look to everybody in this room that, through the connectivity that we're establishing during this process, we need to sell it hard, right? I'm hoping the Chancellor will be standing up in the autumn. I'm not sure if I said. So the goal is to deliver a sort of an interim report by the end of the summer, some review in the early autumn, and some announcements are made around the autumn statement. And we need to sell it hard at that point, right? And we need, ecosystem buy-in. So recommendations where 3/4 of the people in the ecosystem say, well, I don't acknowledge that, and I don't think that's a problem, or that won't work for me, is not going to be any good, right? So I'm putting it back on you. I think you can help us be successful with this if we come up with something that you can get behind and sort of drown out most of the naysayers. That's the goal.
Thank you. Hugh Vasey from the Economic and Social Research Council. So as a bit of context, part of my job is to grow commercialisation from social science research. And, looking into this area, there's a few differences in social science research, not least because it's starting from a much lower base. But my question in terms of a review is, are you thinking about spin-outs from universities with very high potential social or environmental return on investment, but slower or lower economic returns?
Yes, thank you. I should have said exactly that, and I didn't. Yes, the short answer is yes. The slightly longer answer is I think the internal word we're using is impact. So that can be economic impact for sure, but it can certainly be social impact, it can be environmental impact, it can be healthcare impact. There's a number of different factors there. So the short answer is yes. I also, thank you, while you reminded me, my comments were also mostly focused on spin-outs that are likely to arise from life sciences or physical sciences or computer science research. That was a bit narrow as well. I think there's growing interest in combining the social sciences with the hard sciences in some of these spin-outs, and there's great impact coming there as well. So we are looking more broadly, and if you think, if anyone in the room has recommendations for how to do that well, has seen some best practices or has seen some things that have been missed, we would welcome those suggestions. Hi. And Robin's got his laptop out here, you see, so he's in real time where we're updating the database of information.
Hi, Adam Stoughton from Evotech and ex of Oxford.
We were talking about you over lunch, yes.
Oh, sounds ominous. The question is really to what extent you're looking at the culture within universities which can enable academics to even contemplate investing the often very significant time needed to get a new company off the ground. And which I've seen firsthand can vary greatly department to department. There's huge heterogeneity there. So are you looking at broad recommendations for universities that will be enabling for academics who might be thinking about going down that route?
This is going way too well, by the way, Dario, isn't it? But it'll get tougher in a second. Again, thank you. Yes, that's a brilliant question and something I should have spoke about but didn't. Yes, so look, I touched on this a little bit in terms of trying to stimulate the entrepreneurial culture and the cross-fertilization of sort of cultural understanding between academics, TTOs, investors, startups, and how they all work. But there's more to it than that, as you said. So we've had many examples of academics who had considered a spin-out and had looked and thought, either, oh, that just looks like really hard work, and I'm not sure I'm up for that. I'd rather just run my lab and write my papers, or that's a massive time commitment, and I've got a young family. So diversity of founders is a key point. We don't want either the founders or the investors to look like me, basically. And so I think particularly young female academics, and this is something that you can imagine Irene is laser focused on and is driving a lot of initiatives at Oxford around. So how does one take entrepreneurial leave, for lack of a better word, without it impacting your career trajectory within the university? There's some interesting work that's gone on at Stanford. We've got the head of Stanford's TTO on our advisory board. So they're obviously very focused on so-called tenure track, and they have a policy where you can take a year out to do a startup, and they stop the clock on your tenure track, for example. So a very important thing here. Not quite same issue here in the UK. So those kind of initiatives, so looking at the friction points that are preventing what would otherwise be very talented entrepreneurs getting into the game is something we're looking at. The ref feeds into this. So obviously there's growing recognition of the impact of commercialization in the ref, and the case studies and things are getting increasing weight. I don't want to scare anyone by suggesting we'd rewrite the ref or something like that. I think that would be moving tectonic plates, wouldn't it? But is there sufficient recognition of the translational impact in the broader sort of career trajectory of an academic? I think we're going from, frankly, when I was a graduate student, at the point where that's all a bit commercial and unseemly and grubby, trying to make money out of physics, right? To a point today, I think we passed through neutrality maybe sort of 10 years ago, and now we're at the point where it is recognized as valuable, but whether it's fully recognized, I'm not sure. And so I think we're still on a journey, and we'd like to maybe do a bit more about that. So yeah, thank you for raising that point. Hello.
Hi, Nicola McConville from, what was Taylor Vinters, and it's now Mishcon Dorea. So we work with about 25 universities looking at various sort of different shapes of spinouts. But I had a question about funding.
Yeah.
So if you sort of think about funding traditionally, it's a lot of charitable funding, a lot of foundation funding, a lot of VC funding. Have you looked at alternative sources of funding, pension funds, that kind of thing, to see whether we can unlock different capital to come into this sector?
Goodness, thank you very much. Good question. In my other day job, I chair the Venture Capital Committee of the BVCA, and our number one policy agenda over the last couple of years has been trying to bring DC pension money into this sector. For those of you who aren't so familiar with this issue, if I was running my firm in Silicon Valley, maybe up to half the capital that I would be investing, the so-called limited partners who invest in my fund, would be pension funds. And most pension funds in the US run an endowment style model where they would have a significant allocation to what's called alternatives, that's venture capital and private equity. Could be 15-20%, something like that. Unfortunately, we don't have that situation in the UK right now, and there are historical reasons for that. There's a shocking statistic that the defined benefits, so these are the old pensions, the sort of final salary pensions, are now only 4% invested in equities, mostly because they're sort of winding down and they're managing their liabilities, and they can do that through more structured instruments. So we've sort of written those off. The more interesting one is the DC pensions, the defined contribution pensions, which is what most new employees would have had over the last 10 years, where you're sort of making monthly contributions. The headline number, and it's a good headline number, is that by 2030, UK DC pensions will be £1 trillion. And so if we could get 5% of that allocated to growth, private growth companies, essentially what everyone in this room is trying to create, that's an absolute game changer. That's not primarily this review. That there are other reviews and processes going on right now, and that actually we're making great progress on that. But there is definitely an intersection, and the way I see that is what Irene and I have been charged with is coming up with a set of recommendations that will optimize the chances that businesses will be born and nurtured to the point where they could benefit from that scale-up capital. So if there is something, and we have many examples from some of the investors we talked about where mistakes made in the cap table in the foundation stage, you know this as a corporate lawyer, just continue to eat away at the management team and distract them, and every team meeting starts with, well, I haven't got enough equity and whatever. Right, so if we need to assess those kind of things. And so, again, those of you who follow the Twitterverse, there's actually some data going around right now about sort of uninvestable cap tables and so-called dead equity. And this is it's probably not for today, but there is a conversation about how much equity should be allocated to people who are building the businesses and will be managing it going forwards versus those who had a sort of a legacy contribution. The Professor Sir X, typically, who maybe demands more than is appropriate. So the short answer is it's not for this review other than to position for it, but it's fundamentally important. And I'm quite optimistic, actually, that, again, just because it's a topic close to my heart, there's something called lifts going on. Does anyone in this room know what lifts is? No. Okay, I can see a couple of nods. Lifts is a £250 million pool of capital that has been created by the Treasury to incentivize exactly what you talked about, to create new funds for investing in this space. And basically a DC pension fund, one or more, has to step up and say, okay, we'll finally get in the game. And the government will provide some matching funding from British Business Bank, and then we'll free up that capital. So if we get this right, I mean, we could massively open the spigot and really turbocharge things. So I'm quite excited about it, actually. Yeah. Thank you.
Excuse me, Elaine Eggington from IP Pragmatics. So my question is linked to that finance one, but is at the other end of the scale, at the pre-seed end of the scale. And I think if I were queen for a day, then that's where I would find some ring-fenced money that is available for all the universities to draw from. Are you looking at that end of it as well?
Yes, we are. Well. So there's a couple of things we're looking at. Tell me if maybe this is what you're getting at or not. Translational funding. So there is a gap between where traditional EPSRC, MRC, fundamental science funding stops, sort of TRL level, if you're familiar with that, and where either corporate in-licensing or venture capital backing of startups starts. And actually that gap's getting bigger because corporates are getting more risk averse, they're scaling down their internal R&D budgets. So they want to in-license later. MRC hasn't really nudged it. So there's a gap here. So one of the phenomena we've seen is businesses or spinouts being created too early because there's no other way to fund that gap. And as soon as you take in venture capital, I'm expected to deliver 35% IRR. That puts massive pressure to scale and productize and launch and all the rest before you're really ready for it. So are there pools of funding to address that? That is absolutely in scope. We are working up a recommendation along those lines. So it's interesting. So your suggestion was a national pool that essentially would be competitively bid for. That's Robin's making a note. You could think, we'd love to hear if you have additional thoughts on sectors and geographies. I think some of this can feed into the regional ideas I was talking about. There are some regions where it's harder to get access to that sort of pre-seed capital because there's no angel investment and things like that. Cambridge, we have quite a vibrant angel investor group who will sometimes support that pre-seed stage, but yes is the short answer.
Thank you. David Russell from PraxisAuril. Most people who work in the sector are in it for the long term, but if the opinion polls are to be believed, this government might not be. I just wondered if you were able to say anything about how the issues that you've been looking at play out in a more cross-party context.
Yeah, well, first of all, I think the silver lining on that is there is great motivation within the current government to get stuff done in months, not years, right? And so as we think about our king or queen for the day recommendations, they should be things that are actionable relatively short term. I think those are the most likely to be adopted. So that's point number one. Point number two, if you look at what Jim O'Neill's review recommended, well, Rachel Reeves was in the press just last weekend, 10 days ago. 5% of DC pensions, she was actually suggesting mandating it, which I think is maybe pushing it a little bit, but basically this exactly the same idea. You've got these great British private growth companies that can deliver outsized returns for pensioners. It's a win-win, just do it. So those kind of things I think are happening. I've spent more in my BVCA role and my spin-out role quite a lot of time with Chi Onwara, who is the George Freeman of the Labour Party, roughly speaking. They've moved their roles around a bit. She thinks about the world in a very similar way. Former electrical engineer, spent some time in the States looking at in the startup ecosystem. There's probably an even stronger emphasis on regional development coming from the Labour Party. But I think that's a detail, and actually the kind of recommendations we were going with, I would be disappointed if they just got thrown out and as a completely different set. Oh, I'm sorry. There's one down here as well. Yeah. Okay.
Thank you. I'm Liam Sutton from the University of Bradford. I've got a question about the diversity of founders, investors, people active in the ecosystem.
Yes.
What do you know about that? Is it part of the terms of reference? If so, where's the thinking?
What do we know about it? There's quite good data, actually. There's probably better data on that than there is on some of the finance stuff, actually. So the British Business Bank, for example, put in place an initiative called Investing in Women Code a few years ago that firms like mine are all signatories of. It's front of mind, actually, because they report annually, and the data just came out earlier this week. And they've also expanded that to look at ethnic diversity as well. And as always, I think you first have to have the data, and you have to track something before it can be actionable. So the data they're collecting is percentage of spin-outs that have at least one female founder on the management team that are created, that pitch venture firms for funding, are successful in receiving that funding, and the outcomes thereafter. Also looking at the other end of the spectrum of diversity in boards of spin-outs. We haven't really talked much about boards and governance. I think it's fundamentally important. My own anecdotal, but I've now probably been on 100 boards over the last 20 years, is that performance data is absolutely black and white. If you don't have any women on your board, it's a dysfunctional board, and I won't do it anymore, actually. So we're pretty much at a quota system within my firm. So that data is being collected. It goes back to the point we were talking about in terms of entrepreneurial leave and skills training. The rate of progress is, in my opinion, poor. So if you look at the percentage of female founders, it's been in the low 20s, and it inches up 1% or 2% every year, but it's still pretty poor. Female representation on boards, also poor. I think I'm absolutely convinced that it's not selection bias with investors or within TTOs in terms of who gets funding and who gets support, because I mean there's immense goodwill and understanding to try and move the needle. It's a self-selection thing at the beginning of the funnel, right? I was just talking to Irene about this the other day, and I think self-selection comes in different forms. For things like leadership roles and board roles, it's a cliche, but I think it's a true cliche that somebody like me sees a job spec to be an NED of a company, and I meet 60% of the criteria. I'm like, oh, good enough, I'll apply. Yeah. Whereas my female counterpart sees that and says, oh, I'm not qualified, and doesn't apply. So those sort of cultural differences are something that need to be addressed through, I think, role models and thought leadership and advice, and there's lots of things that can be done. I would welcome suggestions. I think it doesn't cost any money or very little, and it can be built into some of these skills and advocacy programs. And so to the extent that you've seen things that are working around the world anywhere, we would love to incorporate those. So, you know, it goes without saying, I think there's an email address for this review. So if I'm going to have to run off and get a train fairly soon after this, but you can either nobble these two guys, or you can email us any of your suggestions afterwards, and hopefully you're getting the message. We're very much open to any and all suggestions.
Can I
Hello.
ask hello, hi. Linda Wallace from Edinburgh Napier up in Scotland. I'm quite interested in whether you've thought about joining up your entrepreneurial ecosystem and the wider sort of entrepreneurship that universities are doing. So as almost like, it's not all about IP businesses. We do create a lot of knowledge ecosystems around the regions that we're in.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering if you've thought about developing or investing in particular types of businesses in particular regions, because I think that would create a lot of synergies in that region.
Yeah.
And I think thinking about spin-outs separately, I mean, you have emphasised it's a tiny part of what we do.
Yeah, no, I mean,
I just don't see why it's almost like a little bit taking it in isolation.
Yeah.
So what's happening about, you know, the regional sort of strengths?
Yeah.
And I just wanted to highlight one thing, is that in an FDI session earlier, they talked about where the FDI is currently, and you could look at that kind of data.
Yeah.
You could look at FDI data into different regions and think of the strengths of the region.
Yeah. So, I mean, there is a somewhat myopic focus on spin out because that's what we were charged with doing. But I realised that, you know, spin outs are very much in vogue, but they're not the only story by any means, right? I think with regard to the regional, what do you say, synergies, that's what I was trying to get at with the critical mass point as well, that if you've got a region which is particularly strong in, let's call it biotech, for example, really leaning into that and looking at how you can support best practices and incubating and accelerating more spin-outs, because that's what we're here to do, in biotech in that region, and tapping into the talent base and all this. That might be the quickest way to get the sort of acceleration factor that we're looking at. So we're definitely looking at that.
Can I just ask a slight supplementary question? There are big investments in the R&D landscape, and the idea behind them would be to try and create aligned startups and attract investment in around particular science areas.
Yeah.
So
Are you talking about government R&D? Or,
yeah,
yes.
R&D, triple helix type investments and industrial strategy challenge fund, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
So could I mean, it's.
So we are joined up with all of
You're
that,
joined
because
up with
that's all within DSIT and
Okay,
Treasury, and so
fine.
yeah, thank you. Yeah.
One last question over there.
Oh, I'm getting the hook. Thank you so much for taking the time to join and for really a great set of questions. Please do send us the feedback. Please do return the TTO survey that Robin will send you next week, and please push out our founder survey to anybody who looks like a founder. The more data, the better. Thank you very much.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Andrew. I know you've got to catch a train, so we'll let you do that. That brings our conference to an end, and just remains for me to formally close the conference. We've had an absolutely terrific range of speakers and topics and sessions, I think, and that's a real testament, I think, to the pulling power of you. All the speakers are here, Andrew included, because you are here. And I think that's really important to bear in mind, that when the community comes together under the banner of PraxisAuril or in any other way, you have great convening power, you have great pulling power. You are politically important, you are economically important, you are socially important, and that's why everyone wants to come and have your ear. Do keep telling us about what you'd like to see at the conference and who you'd like to see. We're really interested in getting that live feedback about how we can continue to diversify. We've had lots of that the last few days, but do keep doing that. I've got a few words of thanks that I really desperately want to give. It's very important to me. I want to thank all the speakers and, of course, the sponsors of the conference. I'd like to thank the organising committee and the board that backed them. It was a great surprise to me coming into post to find the amazing amount of work that's done pro bono by the community, for example, especially in the organising committee. So I'd really like to thank all of them. I'd like to thank the PraxisAuril team, who've been absolutely fantastic throughout. I've had lots of positive feedback about their professionalism, their responsiveness, their positivity, and I am going to embarrass two of them in particular by naming them. I want to thank Anita MacDonald and Amanda Mackey, who've both been absolutely stellar, and please can we all show our appreciation for them. Finally, of course, I'd like to thank you for coming and for your organisations for supporting your time here. I know it's not always easy for you to be released from your day jobs, so we do very much appreciate that. And I just want to leave you with 3 words for the journey home, all beginning with P. They've been resonating for me the last couple of days. The 3 words are people, professionalism, and positivity. I was told by Ian, our chair, the day I came in, he said, KE is a people business. And I've really seen that over the last couple of days. There's an amazing community, how collegiate it is, how buzzy it is, how committed it is, and just how kind of joyful it is. It's really been a fantastic experience for me as a new person coming in. Thank you for making me so welcome. My second P is professionalism. PraxisAuril is your professional body. We do lots of the things that you need us to do, but you deserve more. You deserve us to be a fully fledged professional body that does all the things a profession needs. I was very interested to hear Andrew use the phrase a couple of times, a nascent industry. And that's the sense I have. This is a sector which is growing and changing in a very exciting way. And you need a fully fledged professional body to support that process. And that's what we promise to be. And my last P was positivity. I've just got an amazing sense of the positivity in this room, in this conference, in this sector over the last few days. I was sitting next to a colleague at dinner last night who's a senior leader in this sector, and she said to me, I've been in this game for a long time, and I really feel like it's better than it's ever been. It's changed for the better. It's continuing to change for the better. PraxisAuril wants to be part of that change, accelerate that change, support that change for your benefit, not for ours, and for you and for the work you do, which is so important. Thank you very much for coming, and safe journey home.